I don't know. All right. This hearing on the Congressional-Executive Commission on China will come to order. The title is Tibet from All Angles, Protecting Human Rights, Defending Strategic Access, and Challenging China's Export of Censorship Globally. We'll have one panel today. It features Don Dup Wangchen, a Tibetan filmmaker and recently escaped political prisoner, Tenzin Dorji, who's the commissioner, Dr. Tenzin Dorji, who's the commissioner of U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, also an associate professor at California State University in Fullerton, Dr. Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan, Chair, Center for Strategic and International Studies. We thank you all for being here. Without question, Tibet remains one of the most sensitive issues in U.S. China relations. Conflict between Tibetan aspirations and Chinese policy is found within cultural, religious, and educational spheres. As the Chinese government seeks to diminish or altogether eliminate aspects of Tibetan culture that it regards as threatening, the peaceful exercise of internationally recognized human rights is systematically suppressed. Inside the Tibet Autonomous Region and Tibetan Autonomous Region areas, Chinese officials have increased restrictions on the religious and cultural life of Tibetans over the past decade by implementing pervasive controls and restrictions on religious practice. This trend was highlighted in the Commission's most recent annual report. Beginning in 2016, Chinese authorities targeted renowned centers of Buddhist learning with demolition and reportedly expelled more than 4,800 Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns and subjected them to periods of patriotic education, and I say that within quotes, patriotic education lasting from several weeks to 6 months. There are more than 500 cases of Tibetan political or religious prisoners currently in detention who are in this Commission's political prisoner database, a staggering figure that is far from exhaustive. Access to Tibet for foreign journalists, non-governmental organizations, and diplomats remains severely restricted. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party's government exports its authoritarianism abroad, pressuring foreign academic institutions who invite the Dalai Lama to speak on campus, as well as businesses who mention his name or the Tibet Autonomous Region as a distinct region. It is this dimension of global Chinese censorship which has thus thrust Tibet into the news in recent days. Every week, it seems, another major international company is publicly, and in some cases shamelessly, apologizing to the PRC for some sort of misstep related to Tibet, the Dalai Lama, or otherwise sensitive issues. Driven by their bottom line and China's vast market, many companies are increasingly prepared to toe Beijing's line. There's a certain grim irony to the Chinese government demanding that businesses apologize for social media posts on social media platforms that are actually blocked inside of China. It is clear that the cost of doing business for foreign companies in China keeps getting steeper, and at the same time, there's little price to be paid in the West when companies engage in self-censorship to further their bottom line, despite the fact that it is antithetical to the values that underpin our own society, the values, by the way, that allowed these companies to even exist in the first place. We will explore all of these topics during today's hearing, in addition to the future of the Dalai Lama's succession, China's efforts to control water resources and expand its military presence on the Tibetan Plateau, and the impact on the broader U.S. strategic interest in human rights. Before turning to our witnesses, I would be remiss if I did not underscore how pleased we are to welcome the Tibetan filmmaker Don Dup Wangchen to today's hearing. It is not often that we are able to welcome to the witness stand political prisoners whose cases the Commission has highlighted in our prisoner database, in letters to the administration, on our social media. Set against the backdrop of a different Olympic Games in Asia, it is fitting to recall that Mr. Wangchen's crime, quote unquote, was the making of a short documentary film, Leaving Fear Behind, in 2008, which was based on 108 interviews he conducted with Tibetans who expressed views on a range of issues from the Dalai Lama to the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Golong Jigme, Mr. Wangchen's assistant in producing the film, was among the witnesses at an April 2016 Commission hearing titled China's Pervasive Use of Torture. He too was subsequently detained in 2008 for his work on the documentary, and during his detention he was severely tortured. Mr. Wangchen, we welcome you to America. We welcome you to safety and to freedom, and we stand with you in working towards the day when the Tibetan people are afforded these same protections. I now recognize Congressman Smith for his opening comments.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rubio, and again, thank you for your extraordinary leadership on this commission. This hearing again reminds us of the dire and worsening situation of the Tibetan people inside of China. Along with you and my colleagues, would very, very robustly like to welcome Dundup Wangchen to the United States. We're glad you're here and finally reunited with your family. And what an unbelievable irony that at a time when China is buying Hollywood and buying access and buying companies to influence product, that a man who speaks so eloquently to another product, and that's repression, would find himself so horribly mistreated. So we are so glad you are here. And as the chairman said, you were one of the key focuses of this commission for a very long time. So thank you for being here. You are one in a long line of heroic dissidents and former prisoners of conscience who have testified before this commission. The Chinese government may not like our efforts, and that's an understatement. They don't like a light being shown on their human rights abuses, but nothing good happens in the dark, and we need to accelerate what we are doing to bring focus and scrutiny to their abuses. We are looking today at Tibet from all angles as a human rights issue, as a critical matter of U.S. diplomacy, and as a geostrategic concern. Too often, human rights and human rights diplomacy are discounted or ignored as a secondary concern in bilateral relations. That has been a bipartisan failure by a number of White Houses and State Departments. They are too often viewed as problems and not real interests in the United States. And I believe that sells out the dissidents and sells out the best and the bravest women and men in China and anywhere else where we practice that kind of subordination of human rights to other concerns. It is abundantly clear that we are in direct link between China's domestic human rights problems and the security and the prosperity of the United States. There is a link. The health of the U.S. economy and the environment, the safety of our food and drug supplies, the security of our investments and personal information in cyberspace, the academic freedom of our universities, and the stability of the Pacific region will all depend on China complying with international law, allowing the free flow of news and information, complying with its WTO obligations, and protecting the basic rights of Chinese citizens, including the fundamental freedoms of religion, expression, assembly, and association. Losing sight of these facts leads to bad policy, bad diplomacy, and the needless juxtaposition of values and interests. It also sends the wrong message to those in China standing courageously for greater freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law. There's the issue of corporate capitulation, referenced by our distinguished chairman, as Mercedes-Benz pulled an advertisement on Instagram with the Dalai Lama, and the quote, "Look at a situation from all angles and you will become more open." Like Delta and Marriott before it, Mercedes shamelessly apologized, even though Instagram is blocked in China. And I remind my colleagues that, back in 2006, I began a series of hearings where we had Google, Microsoft, Cisco, and Yahoo. I had them take the stand and swear in. It was an 8-hour hearing. And they were not only censoring all things on their platforms, Google especially, but they were also aiding and abetting the propaganda of the Beijing dictatorship, all for profit. All for profit. And now we see others following that terrible and dangerous precedent of years ago. It has been unabated, and now it's continuing even in a more shameless way towards Tibet. The administration's national security strategy rightly identifies China's foreign influence operations as a strategic threat. It is imperative to counter China's global influence operations and efforts to export its authoritarian model and globally. I chair the Africa Global Health Global Human Rights Committee. We are planning very shortly, and within about a month, a hearing on the influence in Africa. We've had them before, but it is getting worse. The bad governance model of Beijing is being accepted by some, particularly dictatorships like Zimbabwe, and so we need to bring a light there and compete with that influence that is being subjected or imposed, I should say, on Africa. As China increasingly flexes its economic muscle, the result will be more apologies, sadly, accommodations, and self-censorship. Corporate America needs to get more of a backbone. It needs to stand for fundamental freedoms. Yes, make a profit, but do so in a way that does not violate human rights. And it's not just companies that have capitulated, but universities in Hollywood and non-governmental organizations and even whole countries. As China's Belt and Road Initiative expands, so will demands that countries be silent about human rights abuses, silent about religious persecution, and silent about Chinese government's repeated failures to abide by its international obligations. Where is the UN? You know, I have raised it over and over again. The Human Rights Council, even at the periodic review, it's a very short look and scrutinizing. You know, Israel gets unbelievable focus at the United Nations on all things related to human rights. China, not even a slap on the wrist. We should not be silent about the abuses faced by the Tibetan people and religious leaders. The China's Commission's political prisoner database contains records on 600 known Tibetan political and religious prisoners. 43% of those detained are monks, nuns, and religious teachers. Almost all were imprisoned since 2008. The Tibetan people have a right to practice their religion, preserve their wonderful culture, and speak their language. They have a right to do so without restriction or interference. The Chinese government, of course, does not agree. To them, their faith and culture are problems to be solved, not a heritage to be preserved, honored, and protected. To them, the Dalai Lama is an agitator and a revolutionary, not a world-renowned and respected voice for peace and harmony that we know him to be. The Chinese government wants a Tibetan Buddhism that is attractive to tourists for photo ops, and not one that is strongly embraced and revered by the Tibetan people. Allowing greater religious freedom is an essential part of dealing with the grievances of the Tibetan people, but China's answer is always the same: control, manage, and repress, and incarcerate and torture. It is counterproductive, and it violates China's international obligations. Finally, in our dealings with the Chinese government and officials, members of Congress and the administration should affirm the peaceful desires of the Tibetan people for greater autonomy and freedoms within China. We should stress that China's policies create needless grievances, and their repression of Tibet only hurts China's international prestige. It brings dishonor to Beijing. We should demand open access to Tibet by journalists and diplomats, and we should raise the cases of prisoners of conscience with Chinese officials. U.S. leadership on these issues is critical because our allies in Europe and Asia can often be bullied by Chinese threats of economic boycotts. We must demonstrate that Tibet matters, human rights matter, that religious freedom matters to the U.S. China relations. And again, I want to thank Chairman Rubio, who has been a stalwart in speaking out on behalf of human rights all over the world, including and especially in Tibet.
Thank you, and thank you for those kind comments, and thank you as well for your activism and for your work on this commission, and for being accommodating at the late start. We have all these other issues going on. So let's begin with our witness testimony. Mr. Wang Cheng, we thank you for being here with us today, and we recognize you for any statement you may have for the committee.
It's a form of Tibetan greeting. I am very pleased to be here, to be in the United States Congress, to be addressing you, the members of Congress, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your support for the Tibetan people. I would like to begin by talking about the reason why I made the movie Leaving Fear Behind. The Chinese authorities were in the launching a campaign about disinformation about what the Tibetan situation is, what Tibet is. They claim that there is religious freedom in Tibet, there is freedom of expression, etc. So wanted to address all these issues.
주땡기 단지티 메바주고요 봐. 아니 특별히 공사장원 침부치라. 아니 제마당 정조 시적 보시고요 봐. 아니 오면 몽보지게 루 몽보라 사는 게 동에디 셰사 메와 지체 쳐요와지. 한 텐데 손상 아니 가족이다 보는 게 의욕이 있으디 메 몽보지게 년깔라 만제와 아니 제책이 강라 저적시바이.
So the reality is that today life in Tibet is being destroyed. The nomadic tradition of the majority of Tibetans is being destroyed. Tibetans are being forced to denounce His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and there is virtually no space for the Tibetan grievances to be addressed. And therefore, without being afraid of all the risks that entailed, we wanted to make this document to spread the true information about Tibet to the world.
다 텔라테니 다 잔나 춘당 맡은 바기다 전송지 바리 전송지니 다 년참 매래 다지 너죠 다 년참 매래 너죠 당바리 니코게 맞지와 갈라마테와 다지 신앙강 적기는 다 야마 천루지게 다 골라지 사자가와 축구나 하마고와 강조로죠 제니 다 메이나 다 신앙강 적기는 지 저한테게 다 스지질럭들 지고요.
As a result of making that documentary, the Chinese authorities detained and imprisoned me. And during the imprisonment, I suffered both physical torture as well as mental torture. Physically, for days and nights, they would abuse me. Mentally, they would not allow me to sleep. They would not allow me to do anything that I wanted. Wherever they would even instill fear in me by putting a mask or a hood over me whenever they were taking me, handcuffing me, so that I didn't really know where they were taking me.
다 니체 조직에 다 지금 잔나게 지금 자천당 지금 tumbi 니체 지제요 말이 그런 속에 준소받은 듯이 지요 말이 다 딘데게 다 로트게 다 가짜게 니멍레제 가짜게 니멍 통에 로트게
So then I was, without any due process, I was sentenced for 6 years of imprisonment. They did not allow me to have my own lawyers. They did not follow the judicial process in violation of their own constitution. And then they gave me this 6 years of imprisonment.
다 종가나 좋아이네. 다 지금 종바 지금 종화만 치던 제게 다 멤버 지용게 종바게 지금 도당대 요 말이 다 제스 종바이나 특별히 다 지금 단적당 아니 그런 속에 다득지야 너무란 레와지야 다 대소 몽보지라 아니 단적지니 지 정한테 제고요 말 도당테 제고요 말 다 특별히.
So in prison, there was discrimination. Even although as a political prisoner, they should have given me certain rights, they did not do that. So they also did not allow me to have any connections with my family, etc. So virtually they did not give me any rights that they were giving even to other prisoners.
다 그속에 자천랑신게 종박이 도당대조 랑에 다 년시지야라 그런 속라 지금 투니지 가자시야게 지금 고즈와리 데 그런 속에 땅가 베틀랜 마티바 마투와리 데 진행이 다 제치기 돌아다 지금 종박에 니땅 보는 걸 특별히 제수 종박에 니땅 대조 이게 지트니 실록락 거바리 텔라테니 니마 자치 자즈라 낙존나 지와리.
So therefore, I confronted the prison authorities about the rights that a prisoner should be getting, that I should be getting. And that they did not allow me. And then, as a result, I wrote a long petition to the international community about the situation inside the prison, about my situation, about what was happening there. And I sent this petition out in the hope that it will be spread in the international community. However, the Chinese authorities confiscated that petition, and as a result, I was sentenced to 84 days of solitary confinement.
다 로투 동지게 젠당 만자와 쇼거기 주저 강니 쇼피 주저 지와니 아니 공다게 주저 지와 패다 아니 나라 저 그저 지르긴 죽당이나 아니 저 주저 돈박강라 너무라 찌고요.
Even when I was released, my release wasn't like any other prisoners. Normally, prisoners, when they're released at 7, so when prisoners are released, they're released at 7 a.m. and then they're handed over to the family members. However, in my case, I was taken at 4 a.m. and I was able to be at my family's home only at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, after taking me in different ways to the place.
다 전주 토바이나 다 양쪽 정칸치기나 수요바 제스게 다 개간테 로순라 토요바 아니 그런 속에 다 가뒤나 지금 다토지야 다지 파츠란 루야 디줄라 다지 당전지니 미술란 루아 지고요나 가완 루고요나 그노줄라 니시시고가
Even after release, I was virtually in prison. My political rights were taken away for 3 years, and wherever I had to give, wherever I would like to go, it would be monitored and had to seek permission from the authorities.
다 저런 게 땅가 특별하게 당니 특니 아니 저런 게다 직대 논년디 직직가라 아니 개저 창도 아니 저런 게 대란 조식지니 디조 매바조야 디지나 아니 저런 넘어라 넘을 한조 정말 아니 그런조 로바지게 연시.
And they would interrogate me, and one of the issues they always raise with me is, you have made this movie Leaving Fear Behind, which has been internationally known. So if you confess in your wrongdoing about that documentary, then we will help you with your family reunification.
딱 나랑 치고 말이 내 쪽부터말로 노식식 되고래 나랑라 노식식 되고요. 땅가 대살라 노식식 되고요. 다 근데 다 아르 종이나 지금 잔득 종라 가자시어리 지금 너무 단종장게 되거나 지금 먹고 지어리 다 제케 몸부치 초바 몸부치 지어 다 이나 잔득 종티 고쳤던 토요 말이 아니 다마데 다 진행가 몸부치라 주니 아니 루서 몸부치 땅에 록바 몸부치 기타 자초다 듣고라더니 아니 두사 아르란 줘라지.
And it wasn't just me alone that the Chinese authorities were tormenting. The people I made, my friends, the place where I stayed, or wherever I went, those people would also be confronted, would also be interrogated by the Chinese authorities. So I also know that the United States government had appealed to the Chinese authorities about my case, but nothing came out of that thing. So eventually, ultimately, through the help of many people, despite the risks involved, despite having to make a large amount of expenses, I was finally able to escape.
당가랑 다르롱바 조요리 이나야 가다 제수 정보 몸보지 다른 단다 잔나 머부종기다 단적당 득서고라 조요리.
I'm in freedom now. However, there are many people like me who are political prisoners who are under detention in China.
아니 게 다도 좀 뭐 그러면 아니 남바도 또 동안라 대지치시아이 아니 게다 시츠보 아니 부정하게 리세제까지 아니 주랑속에다 보는 게 니츠 신이 눈이 온 딘데요나 아니가 저와 당로지 게 강토토게 무토지기에 대지치.
So I would like my testimony to be read, the full testimony to be on the record, but we'll read excerpts from it.
Without objection, so ordered, and please proceed. Take as long as you would like to.
I was born on October 17, 1974, to a family of Tibetan farmers in Bayan, which is in the province we call Amdo. In today's administrative divisions, Bayan is in Toshar Prefecture, Qinghai Province, People's Republic of China. I arrived in USA on December 25, 2017, and it was the first time in many years that I felt safety and freedom. The reunion with my family in San Francisco was a wonderful moment that I had looked forward to in the past years. With a mixture of joy, anxious joy, and hesitation a man feels who was hindered to be the husband he ought to be for his loving wife, a man who was not given the chance to stand by with fatherly advice to his children in a world full of challenges, and a man denied being the son needed for his aging parents, tormented by the thought that they wouldn't see each other again in their lifetime. Growing up in the remote village of Khotse in Amdo, 2,000 kilometers east of Tibet's capital Lhasa, I started the discovery of my people's history with little knowledge, but with an insatiable and juvenile curiosity about what life has to offer to me. Our family lived in a simple life right at the edge of the Tibetan plateau, bordering the Chinese mainland. I was aware of the repression in the past. I had lost members on both my family, mother's and my father's sides of my family as a result of China's atrocities towards Tibetans. However, it wasn't until I made my journey to Lhasa in the early 1990s as a young adult that I first saw firsthand resistance to China's occupation and political symbols such as the Tibetan national flag. In 1992, I witnessed monks from Ganden Monastery carried out a street protest in Lhasa, Some nuns also protested. I saw armed police and military forces quell the protests in a heavy-handed manner and detain the monks and nuns. It was also in 1992 that I decided to go to India to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama and receive some education. At that time, there were many Tibetans escaping to India. However, I only stayed a year and returned to Tibet in 1993, where I was involved in activism such as helping former political prisoners. I would like to acknowledge my cousin Jamyang Tsultim, who's mentored me in my formative years and who's here at today's hearing. In 1996, my good friend Ganden Mang Jigme Gyatso, a true Tibetan hero, was arrested on charges related to the 1992 protests. Jamyang Tsultim was also arrested, and they both served prison sentences. I was working in Jamyang's restaurant Lhasa, which authorities threatened to close down as it was the center of many of our activities. I spent many years involved in various forms of activism and was detained several times. The longest that I was held in detention for was about 30 days in Lhasa in 2001, but I was never formally charged and was always released. As the 2008 Olympic Games were fast approaching and it was always being reported in state media, I told Jamyang Tsultim, who had by then gone to Switzerland, that I wanted to do something that would have a big and long-term impact and that would reflect the true feelings and wishes of the Tibetan people. This was when we first started thinking about making a documentary film from inside Tibet that would later be known as Leaving Fear Behind. I set to work finding collaborators and traveling all over Tibet to interview ordinary Tibetans. We would record interviews in isolated places so as not to arouse suspicion, and we were always careful to ask whether the interviewers wanted to have their face shown on camera or not. We carried with us the DVDs of the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, which showed U.S. President George Bush awarding His Holiness the Dalai Lama in October 2007. We showed this to many people who became very emotional upon seeing it. Our final footage was taken in Xi'an on March 10, 2008, and handed over to a UK-born Tibetan who helped to ensure that it reached Zurich in Switzerland. We spent that day together unaware that protests had broken out in Lhasa the same day and would continue over the next days and months all over Tibet. Even though I was aware that I was being followed and was under surveillance, it wasn't until March 26, 2008 that I was arrested and interrogated by secret police. I was not kept in a police station or prison, but in a hotel, and my family was not informed of my whereabouts. The torture started as soon as I was detained. I was forced to sit in the tiger chair for 7 days and nights, 8 nights, and I was given no food and was not allowed to fall asleep. It wasn't long before I was back in detention after I was briefly released. Leaving Fear Behind was by then released and distributed online just before the Olympics started in China. Even though I didn't know for sure, I was hopeful that everything had gone according to plan. I suspected that the authorities were building their case against me. I was often interrogated and told I had to denounce His Holiness the Dalai Lama and that if I admitted my wrongdoings, I would be released. I always refused to do these things. I was shown Leaving Fear Behind while in detention in December 2008, a few months before I was released. I will remember this moment forever. The interrogator wanted to know how I knew the people I had interviewed, and then they showed me the edited film and wanted me to confess. For the first time, I watched the film in a Chinese prison. While the interrogator continued to force me to confess my wrongdoing, I just enjoyed in my inside the train scene, the music and the auspicious lyric, and felt immensely proud. I thought that even if I received a 10-year sentence, it would have been worth making the film. I felt happy for the interviewers who had taken great risks to appear in the film, and we had promised them that the film would be seen by the outside world, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama would know about the film as well. So I was happy that I had been able to keep that promise to the interviewers. I remained in informal detention until I was tried and sentenced on December 28, 2009 for 6 years in prison for subversion of state power. The case against me mentioned that the projects I had been involved with printing and distribution books, as well as making fear behind. During my time in various forms of labor, detention, I had to do manual labor, which differed depending on where I was. I had been made to do many different tasks, such as peeling garlic or stitching military uniforms, and was given only 2 meals a day, which were barely adequate. The day would start at around 6:30 a.m., and we had to work until 11 p.m. We never went outside, and I was in constant pain and headaches, with headaches and hurting arms. I always witnessed a difference in how prisoners and political prisoners were treated. When it came to Tibetan prisoners, we were never allowed to speak Tibetan to each other. While in prison, I wrote many letters to my sister and my family members, and the prison authorities took them, saying they would be sent on. After release, I discovered that none of the letters had arrived. In March 2012, it was discovered that I tried to smuggle a letter to the outside world. This letter was a long appeal to the then Chinese President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao, outlining the corrupt prison system and the discrimination that prisoners suffer. I was punished by being placed in solitary confinement for 84 days. Following my release, I was always monitored closely, and the police would contact me constantly. I didn't feel free at all. I wanted to study and improve my Tibetan, and I wanted to work, but in those 3.5 years, I couldn't do anything. Feeling frustrated and increasingly isolated, I decided it would be better to escape from PRC rather than stay under those circumstances without any freedom. While in Tibet, I had information that the outside world, including the United States government, was concerned about my situation. The Swiss, Dutch, and the German governments were also concerned about me. The attention from outside, from civil societies around the world, as well as from governments, definitely helped me. This was reflected, for example, in the way my prison inmates and other prison administration treated me. Though I suffered from being restricted in my communication with my relatives to the effect that as I was isolated from the outside world, I was less subject to arbitrary punishment and beatings. I feel your support for cases like me and Tibetan in general could be of great effect if we regularly recall the ground reality in Tibet. There are thousands of Tibetans like me actively involved in the struggle. Tibetans in Tibet are not victims, but agents of change, trying to explore and use every opportunity to fight for a better future. We need support and partnership from outside world. Every attempt for more freedom or democracy is oppressed by China. It's against the nature of this regime to tolerate freedom and democracy, be it in China, in Tibet, and ultimately in the rest of the world. I'm not a politician, and my knowledge about specifics of your legislative process is limited. My friends from the International Campaign for Tibet in Washington, D.C. explained the goal and important details of their recommendation to the Congress to me. I'm happy to support these recommendations. Actions taken by the U.S. Congress on Tibet send a strong message to the people in Tibet. However, the systematic suppression of free press and reporting from Tibet can only be fought with a systematic counter-approach. Therefore, the Congress should pass the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017. I know that there is a U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues in the State Department, who I would have liked to meet, but I'm told no one has been appointed to this position as yet. And so I would like this position to be filled as soon as possible. I would also like you all to pass the resolutions expressing the sense of the Congress that treatment of the Tibetan people should be an important factor in the conduct of U.S. relations with China. I would like to ask the U.S. administration to raise Tibet in appropriate international fora, including the UN bodies. Finally, I would like to urge China to release all Tibetan political prisoners, including the 11th Panchen Lama, Genden Chökyi Nyima. My wish is that whatever measures you have taken, to do it with the strongest possible conviction in the most forceful and wise manner. As a Tibetan who has tried his best to give a voice to his fellow countrymen, I can assure you that Tibetans in Tibet have not given up. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dorjee.
My thanks to the Congressional-Executive Commission on China and you, Senator Rubio, and Representative Smith, co-chairs of the Commission, and Representative Liu and Senator Dance for today's hearing. I ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record. I'm Tenzin Dorji, a U.S Commissioner. I testify as a proud Tibetan American and Tibetan refugee. I'm joyful to be here with Dudum Wangchen, but saddened that he and his family had to flee Tibet to live in freedom. This is so because the Chinese government seeks total domination by forcing Tibetans to assimilate into the dominant Han culture, seeking to control Buddhism and restricting the teaching of the Tibetan language. The government seeks to advance its Sinicization of religion, infusing all aspects of faith into a socialist mold with Chinese characteristics. Tibet now is a police state because of, 1, the Chinese government implements oppressive restrictions in Tibet and Tibetan areas, including re-education campaigns, extensive surveillance, and intrusive presence of military and security forces. The government quickly suppresses any perceived religious dissent and imprisons and tortures those viewed as threats. While these policies are set in Beijing, Chen Kongto perfected the civilian state when he was Tibet's party secretary. He now is Xinjiang's leader and doing the same thing there. 2, the Chinese government believes that Dalai Lama threatens its control. Officials recognize his central importance to Tibetans. While the Dalai Lama seeks to achieve stability and coexistence between Tibetans and Chinese through the middle way, the government accuses him of blasphemy and splitism, targeting anyone suspected of separatist activities and participating in the Dalai clique. Beijing seeks to diminish the Dalai Lama's international influence. For instance, after delivering a commencement address in 2017 at the University of California, San Diego, the Chinese Communist Party-controlled Global Times condemned the university for inviting him to speak and threatened to withhold visas. Officially atheist, the Chinese government absurdly claims it can select the next Dalai Lama. Such a decision is reserved to the current Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhist leaders, and Tibetan people. If Sino-Tibetan issues does not get resolved, His Holiness has said that the next Dalai Lama will be born in freedom. While the Dalai Lama hopes to return to Tibet, the Chinese government waits for his death outside China, viewing it as a key to resolving Sino-Tibetan issues. However, the consequences of his death in exile will be unimaginable to Tibetans. Some may resort to violence and others to self-immolation. Number 3, the Chinese government imposes intrusive restrictions on public and private religious practice. These include monitoring the training, assembly, selection, and education of Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders. The government seeks to strike at the Tibetan Buddhism's heart by targeting Larung Gar, one of the largest Tibetan Buddhist institutes. The destruction and micromanagement there and in the Yarchen Gar exemplifies Beijing's goal of eviscerating the teachings and study of Tibetan Buddhism so that it serves Chinese Communist Party and government goals. Number 4, the government imprisons subjects to shame trials and tortures prisoners of conscience to control Tibetan Buddhists. These include the Panchen Lama. The Chinese government disappeared him more than 2 decades ago and announced its own pig, whom most Tibetan Buddhists reject. The government must provide videographic evidence of his whereabouts and well-being. I advocate for him in USERV's Religious Prisons of Conscience project. The government detained Trashi Wangchuk in 2016 after he spoke to the New York Times on Tibetan language, education, and culture. He was tried in January 2018. No verdict was issued then. He could face up to 15 years in prison. The Chinese government targeted him because it believes the Tibetan language acquisition impedes the Sinicization of the education system and Tibetan assimilation into the majority culture. Shugi is a Tibetan monk imprisoned for his expressed loyalty to the Dalai Lama. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for conducting separatist activities. His health has deteriorated in prison. Number 5, at least 152 Tibetans have self-immolated since February 2009. Chinese authorities allege that self-immolators threaten stability and security by committing terrorist acts in disguise and to prevent information being disseminated about them by threatening family members with punishment and detaining and torturing those suspected of involvement. Number 6, the long arm of China. The Chinese government has a long arm and a heavy hand in its quest to censor information and criticism about its actions in Tibet. The Chinese government in 2017 warned countries like Botswana and India about the Dalai Lama's planned appearances and pressures the government of Nepal, where about 20,000 Tibetans live, many in former detention camps. The Chinese government's actions pose serious concerns for democratic norms and institutions in the United States. Along with pressuring U.S San Diego, it works closely with the Chinese Students and Scholars Association to pressure other universities. Some characterize the group as a tool of government's foreign ministry. Chinese students with the CSAA harassed me in 2008 when I was a doctoral student at the University of California, Santa Barbara. About 100 tried to disrupt a Tibet event. I was standing alone with the Tibetan flag when about 30 surrounded and screamed at me, calling me a terrorist and a bastard. I stood my ground nonviolently. I also want to touch on Confucius Institutes in the U.S. colleges and universities and its primary and secondary school classrooms. Its mandate is to promote cultural exchange through Chinese language and cultural instruction. A Chinese state organ selects the teachers and materials, thereby allowing it to promote Beijing's ideology and policy goals and softens its authoritarian image by helping shape public opinion. Finally, as an academic, I'm very concerned about Chinese government's attempt to censor and pressure foreign publishers like Springer Nature and Cambridge University Press to block content. Thankfully, Cambridge reversed course after a backlash, but Springer Nature did not. I end today's recommendations with these recommendations, along with designating China as CPC for its violations of religious freedom, with specific sanctions associated with the designation. Congress should pass the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017. USF thanks Senator Rubio for sponsoring this bill, and send delegations to China, request to visit Tibet, and advocate for prisoners of conscience and their families. The United States government should appoint a qualified individual to serve as special coordinator for Tibetan issues at the State Department, as mandated by 2002 Tibetan Policy Act. Sanctions against officials and agencies for participating in or being responsible for human rights abuses, including the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act and the Global Magnitsky Act. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you so much. And finally, Dr. Green.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you very much for inviting me and for your focus on this important issue. It's an honor to appear on this podium with Tenzin Darjin, and particularly with Dondup Wangchun, whose voice is, I think, the most important we'll hear. I hope to add to their comments by framing Tibet issues in the context of U.S. policy towards China, geopolitics, and our national interests, and I would ask that my written comments be submitted for the record. Those who argue that U.S. policy should somehow be distinguished from our values as a nation, I think, misunderstand both our interests and our history. I recently published a history of American strategy in Asia and made the argument with plenty of evidence that American statecraft has successfully prevented the rise of hostile hegemons in the Asia-Pacific region, not just by force of arms or realpolitik, but by investing over the long term in democratic norms and open societies. In Tibet, as in many other parts of Asia today, our consistent support for those same universal values will have an important impact on whether China uses its growing power for coercion and hegemonic control, or finds ways to contribute to regional prosperity consistent with the needs and expectations of her people and her neighbors. We have to recognize that the powerful aspirations of the Tibetan people for dignity, religious freedom, and cultural autonomy intersect with rising geopolitical tensions along the Himalayan plateau. China's insecurity about this region is deeply rooted. In 2008, China's Central Military Commission ranked Tibet as the most critical sovereignty challenge to the country, ahead of Xinjiang and Taiwan. The flip side of this insecurity is expansionism, and Beijing has made dramatic moves to assert strategic dominance over the Himalayan plateau at the expense of rival India. India and China together have 37% of the world's population and only about 10% of the world's water supply, and they're both growing. China has begun damming rivers in the Himalayan plateau and is poised to divert huge amounts of water away from India by damming rivers like the Brahmaputra into China. China has suspended agreements on sharing hydrological information and has defied international demands for transparency on their plans. Beijing has also made moves to establish military dominance in areas contested with India, paralleling similar moves to militarize artificial islands in the South China Sea, but in this case at an altitude of over 10,000 feet. Satellite photos have shown that the PLA is militarizing the area of Doklam with helipads, roads, hardened fortifications only dozens of meters from India's forward outpost. When India tested a ballistic missile capable of hitting China recently, the official Chinese media, by the way, China already has this ability to hit India, called for a counter-strategy of expanding into the Indian Ocean. So the Tibetan struggle is occurring at the epicenter of China's aggressive attempt to consolidate and expand control of its periphery within the Indian and Eurasian continent. Finally, the Tibetan people's aspirations are colliding with the greatest vulnerability of the Chinese Communist Party, that party's inability to accommodate the growing and legitimate spiritual and social demands of all of its 1.4 billion citizens. This includes the most senior figures in the Communist Party. We know, for example, that Li Peng, the premier who ordered the crackdown in Tiananmen, converted to Tibetan Buddhism in his old age. We hosted His Holiness the Dalai Lama at CSIS in 2008, in 2007, and His Holiness put it this way. He said, when you're in your 80s, socialism with Chinese characteristics, not so useful. The spiritual threat of religious freedom in China is something we have to recognize is a regime threat for the Chinese leadership. Driven by all these insecurities, Beijing has chosen to turn away from dialogue with His Holiness's representatives on legitimate questions of religious and cultural autonomy, and instead, as you've heard, to try to break the will of the Tibetan people through a combination of repression, a Hanization of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, massive economic infrastructure building, and political control of the succession to the 15th Dalai Lama. Steady U.S. support for the Tibetan people is therefore morally and strategically imperative. If we turn a blind eye to coercion by China in any one part of Asia in order to win support by China in another, we'll find we're on a slippery slope. It could be Tibet today, it could be Taiwan tomorrow, it could be Japan the next day. U.S. support is also necessary to demonstrate to the Tibetan people that His Holiness was right to champion the so-called middle way of dialogue with Beijing within the context of China's own constitution, and that those long-suffering and brave people in Tibet and the surrounding regions do not have to choose either surrender or violence. In addition, U.S. support is necessary, consistent U.S. support, to solidify solidarity around the world for Tibet. That solidarity faltered in 2009 when President Obama chose to hold off meeting with His Holiness in Washington. And in Europe and Australia and around the world, there was a palpable effect on what governments were willing to do in terms of taking risk vis-a-vis Beijing to support His Holiness. The Trump administration has not yet fully stepped up to this reality, in my view. The administration's announcement of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy strikes me as the right framing of how we bring our values to policy towards Asia. But as far as we know, this president is the first in 2 decades who has not raised Tibet in meetings with his counterparts. We don't know if the Secretary of State has. The United States still does not have a Tibet coordinator as required under legislation. I understand that the Secretary of State wants to have the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights fulfill this role, which I think would be okay, but there's no nominee for that position. I looked on the website for that Undersecretary's office, and I searched the word Tibet and found 8 references to Tibet being part of China. The 9th reference was to the Human Rights Report 2 years ago, and that was about it. The administration should support, in my view, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017. As a scholar, as a former senior policymaker, I favor dialogue with China on all issues, including this one. And in 2007 and 2008, was involved in a dialogue at CSIS, sanctioned by the Chinese government with Tibetan authorities about the situation in Tibet. That dialogue dried up. The Chinese side cut it off. And I think we need leverage to pry open access and dialogue on Tibet. and the legitimate rights of the Tibetan people. There is, as I understand it, a presidential waiver in the legislation. I think the administration can use this when party officials from the Tibet Autonomous Region are ready for serious dialogue, but without some kind of pressure, I don't think we're going to get the Chinese side taking us seriously on this issue. In particular, as China closes off the region to journalists, scholars, officials, and tourists, reciprocity is a critical part of American or any country's foreign policy strategy. I would conclude by emphasizing that what I'm describing, what I think U.S. policy is aiming at, is achieving what Beijing itself has claimed to support in its own constitution and in prior dialogues with representatives of His Holiness, which is respect for the cultural, religious, and social rights of the Tibetan people. And to retreat from that support now would be to signal acceptance of the logic that Chinese power must be accommodated, even when that power is used to reverse rules, norms, and understandings that are vital to peace, prosperity, and U.S. interests in this vital region of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I'm going to yield my opening questions to Senator Gardner. I'm sorry, Daines. Why did I say Gardner? Just met with him. I apologize.
Thank you, Chairman Rubio. And
You don't even look like him.
we're from the same Rocky Mountain region. It's all right. I'll take it as a compliment. Thanks, Chairman Rubio and Representative Smith. Thanks for your leadership, too, this important commission. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for coming before us and providing your perspective and expertise on this very important topic. You know, I spent about half a decade, a little more than half a decade, living in China as an expat back in the 90s, working for Procter & Gamble. I've led congressional delegation trips to China while I've been serving here in Washington, D.C. I've had the opportunity to travel across the country. In fact, in 2016, when I led the congressional delegation of senators and members of the House, we went to Urumqi. We got to see the prominent Uyghur Muslim population as well. Last year, we were in Tibet, and we got to see firsthand the Buddhist monks, and importantly, how they've been preserving the culture and their religious heritage there. It's allowed me to see firsthand the human rights abuses and challenges the Chinese people face and the positive impact that an American presence can have in that country. In fact, our two youngest children, we have 4 children, our 2 youngest were born in Hong Kong back in the 90s. And so I really see Asia as really part of my experiences. And when I think about China and talk about it, it's not in some theoretical construct. It's something that we have lived and breathed, whether living there or with subsequent visits. These travels have provided me the opportunity to raise critical issues impacting Tibet related to human rights, religious freedom, having access in Tibet with face-to-face dialogue with Chinese officials and leadership. In fact, just yesterday afternoon, I had the opportunity to raise many of these issues directly with Ambassador Sui. He came to my office and we had a good conversation. And while much work needs to be done, it's essential that individual members of Congress and the U.S. government as a whole continue to press China on addressing and reversing course on their ongoing human rights and religious freedom abuses. Question for Dr. Dorji. In your testimony, you focus significantly on the detention of prisoners of conscience. How can members of Congress and the public at large best assist efforts to secure the release of prisoners or advocate on their behalf whether they are detained in Tibet or elsewhere in China?
Thank you, Senator Daines, for this opportunity to respond to your questions. As Commissioner on the use of, we have a Prisoners of Conscience project, and so that tells you how much importance we give to freeing the prisoners of conscience. And what members of Congress could do at any given opportunity, if you could raise not only the individual cases of the prisoners of conscience, but also the policies and laws that have led to that. So that would be very helpful. And to my understanding, that when you use your bully pulpit to advocate for the prisoners of conscience, that makes a difference. Of course, China is not going to let every prisoner of conscience to be free, but that means that when we keep putting pressure out on them, at least that makes a difference in their lives. Maybe they might get a little breather through such influence. And also, members of Congress could adopt prisoners of conscience, and especially in your case, when you visit China and in your meeting with high officials, if you could raise the issues, that would also make a big difference.
Dr. Green and Dr. George just mentioned about making a difference. I have fond memories of our time when we were expats living in Guangzhou. We were able to see how the treatment of children in orphanages was improved because of the presence and interaction of Americans. We'd go there and visit on Saturdays. We would hold these babies that oftentimes weren't receiving this human touch. And we noticed there was a built-in almost accountability that the orphanage started getting cleaner, and the care of these children improved because we were showing up on Saturdays to directly take care of these children and literally just to hold them. I believe this principle can be applied more broadly as well. I've called on Secretary Tillerson and this administration to appoint the Special Coordinator for Tibet. I think that's an important step. If there was a more substantial U.S. presence in Tibet, such as a U.S. embassy, a consulate, a special coordinator, what potential impacts would there be regarding the issues of religious freedom and human right causes in Tibet?
The question's an excellent one, Senator. Thank you. I lived in Asia about 6 years, the same time frame, and have, in my case, I was in Japan, have similar fond memories, traveled extensively throughout China. The crackdown you've heard about is happening as transparency is being closed. It's not just journalists or diplomats, it's scholars, American scholars of Tibet who are being denied access. If we had a consulate in Lhasa, if we had a presence there, it would do a number of things. It would allow academic exchanges, because that's part of what our consulates do. It would allow officers from the U.S. State Department to monitor the cases of individual political detainees, to monitor trials. It would allow them to provide accurate reporting of what's happening to the Tibetan people. And as I was mentioning in my testimony, with respect to a massive infrastructure program and military program in the Himalayan plateau that is destabilizing, that is fundamentally raising tensions. It's an area we need presence and access, not just because of the Tibetan people's aspirations, but because of the negatively spiraling geopolitics between China and India.
So in light of that, Dr. Green, what role do you think human rights would play within U.S. policy towards China as it relates to the broader issues of national security as well as these economic tensions?
So I come at this as a historian and a scholar, but also for 5 years I was the special assistant and senior director for Asia on President George W. Bush's NSC staff. And in 2007, President Bush told Hu Jintao, with whom he had a good relationship, he said, "I have good news and bad news, which do you want first?" And Hu Jintao had never been asked a question that way. He said, "I'll take the good news." And President Bush said, "I'm going to go to the Olympics." And then President Hu tried to end the meeting without the bad news. And the president said, wait, you have to have the other part. I'm going to meet with His Holiness in the Congress and present him with the Congressional Gold Medal. It is possible to be clear and consistent on human rights and democracy and have a productive relationship with Chinese counterparts. The key is to be consistent. It was in that same time frame that I was able to meet with Dai Bingguo, the state counselor. It was before the Olympics. The Chinese were very worried about their image. They were worried about our election. And the government supported this dialogue I mentioned on Tibet, mostly scholars, but with some participation from government. It was quite productive. When the Olympics ended, when our election happened, they dropped it. So I think it is possible to have a clear voice on human rights. I think it's possible to have a dialogue with China on these issues, but we're going to have to find ways to leverage our relationship with China to push them, frankly, to come to the table.
So in that regard, you highlight that it's readily apparent that China has moved away with this dialogue, from dialogue with the Dalai Lama. What are the prospects for re-engagement, in your opinion, between the PRC and Dalai Lama, and are the ways the U.S. could be productive towards that end?
It is harder now than it was in 2007 and 2008. I think part of that is because of the financial crisis, which I think gave leaders in Beijing an overinflated sense of their own power and leverage. Xi Jinping has a different approach to all these issues. Civil society space is closing in China, including for U.S. companies, as you know. So it's a much harder operating environment. And the Chinese side has passed legislation, as you know, declaring they'll decide who the successor to the Dalai Lama will be. So in diplomacy, when you put that many obstacles, it's hard to restart. But I think it is possible. Number one, President Trump, members of Congress as well, but President Trump should clearly call on Xi Jinping in his meetings, even if it's done privately, to resume this dialogue. Right. Number two, we should be funding and supporting the coordinator for Tibet. We should be reaching out as part of our diplomacy, not just with China, but with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, Korea, and India, to support this as well.
All right, I'm in the extra innings right now. Just to wrap up, I had one last question for Dr. Dorji. In your testimony, you mentioned and thank you, by the way, Mr. Green, you mentioned in your testimony the European Parliament passed a resolution earlier last month in support of human rights activists in China and called for the immediate and unconditional release of targeted prisoners of conscience. What has been the reaction from the Chinese government on this resolution?
I don't know any express reactions by the Chinese to this yet, but we can all guess that they're not really happy at all when we try to put pressure on them. But if you allow me, I'll just go back to the previous question you asked. And one of the things I think many members of the Congress that we try to do is, we should have our embassy in Tibet, and that would really make a big difference, our physical presence in Tibet, right? And that would also, because according to Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, our ambassador has to engage with the human rights leaders, activists. And in my case, Dalai Lama, President of Conscience, is very important. I don't know anything about him, but if we do have a presence there, our ambassador could at least find out reliable information about his well-being.
Yeah. And I think that gets back to closing comment. Engagement generally produces better outcomes.
Definitely.
And on-the-ground presence. We've seen that over and over again, and that's why I support moving in that direction, certainly of an embassy or consulate there in Tibet. So thank you.
Thank you much.
And the time was fine because you took Senator Gardner's time and yours. So to the co-chairman.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask a few questions, and I'll put them out there, and please, whoever would like to take them on. But Mr. Wanchen, thank you for, again, your being here, your unbelievable courage. China's pervasive use of physical and psychological torture, including the tiger chair, which sadly you have experienced, is well documented. It's barbaric, and even the special rapporteur for torture at the United Nations has chronicled as best they can in the past just how terrible China is when it comes to torture. And yet when you Google torture in China, and I've done it in Beijing at a cafe, you found everything that the Japanese did, and they did horrible things to the Chinese people. The rape of Nanking and the use of rape and other terrible, degrading actions, but also the use of torture. And you also get Gitmo and allegations of mistreatment there. Nothing about the UN Special Rapporteur, Manfred Noack's, his statements, or any of that, because it's all censored. I mentioned earlier that in 2006, and I had a series of hearings about the enabling of the propaganda organs of China, and that goes equally, if not more so, for what they do to Tibet in painting a Potemkin village. And yet they continue to this day to be a part of that. And matter of fact, much of their intellectual property has been ripped off since, and now we have other indigenous companies taking that over. But I'd like to, if you could, in more detail, talk about what the Chinese dictatorship did to you physically and to your fellow prisoners, because very often, we'll hear about the tiger chair, we'll hear about, the beatings, the electric prods, and under the arms and at the genital areas, and until we really say, what does that mean? How does somebody like yourself cope with that while you're undergoing it? And then after the fact, I've written 4 laws called the Torture Victims Relief Act, the original and then the 3 reauthorizations. And from that, I've learned about how the post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by many political and religious prisoners is off the charts. Inability to sleep, flashbacks of memory, and I'm wondering how you cope with it now, as well as during your horrible ordeal. Secondly, the fawning of the world media of Kim Jo-yo-jung, the sister of the Kim Jong-un, and she, as we know, heads up the propaganda and agitation department. Matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal, I think, did a very good piece called The Twisted Sister, called her the Twisted Sister of Kim. In this room, Josh Rogan has written incisively about China. Fred Hyatt has done one superlative editorial after another that doesn't join the world press in fawning over the Chinese dictatorship. I remember when Hu Jintao was here, and infamously, President Obama had a press conference with him, and when asked a good question about human rights, Obama defended Hu and said, well, they have a different culture, and over time things will change. No, they don't. As Mr. Rubio, Chairman Rubio has, because he leads on human rights in so many places, but including Cuba, dictatorships don't matriculate from barbaric behavior to peace and democracy and rule of law without a great deal of push and exposing. And yet our media so often just covers up what Xi Jinping and all of his predecessors have done. Xi Jinping right now, and Mr. Green, you spoke to this, Professor Green, about, things have changed, they've gotten worse, the NGO law, as well as the law on religion. Xi wants to either control religion completely or eviscerate it. And of course, when you talk about the Tibetan Buddhists and the passing potentially of the Dalai Lama, and then they pick the next successor, which is outrageous. They're doing it with the Catholic Church as well, different, it's with bishops. If you could speak to that as well. The media, its complicity by not exposing, except for some notable honorable mentions, like I mentioned. On Olympics, if you could speak. I was there in the early 1990s. I met with Wei Jingsheng. He was briefly let out of prison to get Olympics 2000. They didn't get it. They hauled him back in and beat him almost to death because his high-value political prisoner status did not buy them the Olympics in 2000. They got it in 2008. Scott Flipsy, Frank Wolf, and I, Scott works, of course, as part of our key staff. We went and we met with Ambassador Rant. We met with others. We brought this commission's database and said, don't just raise it, become Johnny One Notes about release the prisoners. Because right now they're keeping dissidents away from Beijing, away from journalists, and of course that goes doubly so for the Tibetans who are incarcerated, usually in place there. The question there is, why, you're right, we need that special envoy. There are other special envoys, including for combating anti-Semitism. This administration has a reluctance to name special envoys. That's got to change. But we do have some hope, too, and maybe we want to speak to this as well. Senator Rubio, Senator Daines, and others worked very hard to get Sam Brownback agreed to by the Senate as Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. Ambassador Brownback, when he was a senator, did HRES 483 on Tibet. He gets it. You read that resolution, without a shadow of a doubt, he gets it. Naming prisoners of conscience, Tibetan Buddhists who were being incarcerated, and of course some of whom were killed and executed, and the importance of a robust response from the United States. So he's someone we all need to be. He was just confirmed, as you know. He needs to make this a priority, obviously, of the International Religious Freedom Office and do it right now. But we have a great friend there, and that's a reason for some hope. So just a couple of thoughts, if you could respond to any of it. But again, starting with you, Mr. Wang Cheng, how do you cope with what you've been through?
Та нэрчүүд та макро ранкрч хаяр. Та меги санууч гоёр. Та меги мүжиг хоронда напуз гоёр. Nga rawching ta jano rojong ta ta kuamp ge nyenchi ta ti kini onda. Churang dinala kajashi goyos.
Actually, I didn't really have a choice not to be subjected to such tortures. The Chinese authorities left me with no other choices. They would In fact, one time they brought a recording device to me and wanted me to record something.
땅에 파마, 지미, 버거, 대주 청마, 야갈라 요레스. 이 로년 전에 초과긴간 직계신이 로년 디지와인스. 이티 마지나 이 파마다 지트 대주게 제솔라니까 요레스. 저런 게 딘데쇼달라 저런 로또 땅거스. 이제 저런 게 나니 자진 쓰여와리. 다 딘데기 신앙다 지금 나쳤던 거요.
They used a psychological threat saying that if you record a message, at that time my parents, my wife, my children were in India. And so they said that if you say that because the Tibetan Youth Congress in India was posing a threat to my parents, my children, and my wife's life, if I have to make this documentary. If I say that, they said I would be treated leniently. Otherwise, they said I had committed a very major crime and would be persecuted.
다 미리 샤트드 트립이 미츠마 직바로와 나의 요리 개지야 요리 다 이나 지 수수기 지금 가르쳐 제소다 달리 동트고요 이나다 수수지 제소때 리당하게 저한테 요아 말다 그런서 내초 찍어오네 가트이나 다득지고 다 수수라 지 제소때도 다 지금 개신 댕까 찍거나 다 수이나 지 시주틴 댕기지.
Under such a situation, we all are the human beings, same whoever we are. We have the same pain and we have the same blood and the same flesh. So if under such a situation, if I were given a choice, I would have been chosen to die rather than to survive these. But I didn't even have that choice.
다 여문나 벤자티즈게 굴라 유즈고 땅에 벤자 장츠 수슬라요. 여문나 저런 게 벤자게 두슬리지 저런라 누승에 그치니 저런 게 롱년티 주지니 아니 티쇼지 티시에다 저런 게 벤자라 그런서 가게 지태게 말이지 저런 로트 동고서 딱 그런서 그 가티이나 지 보는 게 링크 가리피바이나 슬록이 미깅에 그치니 다 저무치라 가탄 저무치라 가티이나 전조지고 다 저무치 다 슬록라 요쪽에 보면 대수게 두승에 그치리 보는 누스지 가티게 샹급이고 다 가티이나 전조지에 잔능라 구야 그런 게 속에 스치럭터 지고바티 미게 산루랑쟁기 지 티지고요 미게 산루 촉된 루고다.
So I could see that they were trying to use me to serve a broader political agenda they had. They would even say at one time that I should say that my cousin, Jamyang Sultan, who's in Switzerland, that he was the one who instigated me to make that documentary. Or they would say that whatever happened in Tibet, they would always blame the Tibetans outside or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, etc. So that is what they were trying to do.
다 일단 지금은 미 몽부치게 런을 미소당 바리. 다 호타 켈라손이 크로즈게 제적 드라마다 지와리. 아니 대지 저무치라 참에지. 디제지 삼바네 호타 청마기 따지 노바메 단 노바 경기 말과 직진 햄바시고라. 아니 로마 청마기 따 수수게 지 제일라마다 스위치게나다 전조진도 요 말이 지 되게 말과. 아니 정델라 진적지고요 지 겜보지니다 베호마 몽부스니 전주지와.
So in 2012, there were several self-immolations in Tibet, and then the Chinese authorities went to schools forcing the students to denounce His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But obviously the Tibetan students, they couldn't do anything that was untruthful like that at all. So these are some of the things that they were trying to do.
딱 그런 기록 네 로즈 미치게 로즈 나포조고리 미치게 말이 몇상 그런 게다 로즈 좀 나포조고로
So because of that, in the school, the students protested, saying that it was injustice, and therefore many of the students were detained. But he was saying that overall, because of all these factors, he was able to consider these as the Chinese tortured, and to say that I need to overcome all these.
Before one other thing very briefly to put on the table, and that is the transfer of population, the Han transfer. I know the Dalai Lama has written about that. And any insights you can give as to how they are displacing Tibetan Buddhist indigenous people by bringing others in. Back in 1987, I remember reading an op-ed by John Avedon in the Washington Post called The Rape of Tibet. And he talked about an issue that I have been working on since 1983, and that's forced abortion and coercive population control pursuant to the one-child per couple policy, which obviously applies to all people, but it's used with a special telling effect as an act of genocide against the Uyghurs and as well as against the Tibetan Buddhists. Any insights any of you might have on that? If you kill the child because they happen to be Tibetan, indigenous persons, that's part of this transfer of population. They just don't exist. And it's an insidious crime against humanity, obviously, but it very seldom gets any focus.
I would like to respond to some of the things you raised in the second part of the question. As the Commissioner on the USF, I want to tell China that when we, the international and US, demand human rights in China and Tibet, we are doing that following the international standards, universal human rights. I am an intercultural communication scholar, and we don't define human rights in terms of specific cultures. We are looking across the cultures and using international standards to talk about that. So China, if it wants to be a part of the global community, must learn to respect international standards. You cannot have a double standard here. Another issue that you have raised about is the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which really concerns most of us, it would unimaginable consequences if His Holiness Dalai Lama would pass away in exile. Of course, China thinks they have a perfect solution to this because they always see the Dalai Lama as part of the problem, although we have told them 1,000 times Dalai Lama is the solution to the problem. Hello, listen, And so, of course, they thought they can do exactly like they did to the Panchen Lama. They'll have another pig, fake it out, the tradition system, and have another Dalai Lama. But China must know that if Sino-Tibetan issues doesn't get resolved, His Holiness the Dalai Lama will not be reborn in Tibet under their control. He will be reborn in freedom. Why I say that is in the 80s, I had the privilege to translate for His Holiness Dalai Lama. And when we were in Delhi, he was speaking at Delhi University, an Indian journalist asked whether he would be the last Dalai Lama and the Tibet issue. His Holiness said then, if Tibet issue does not get resolved, he would be reborn in free country, because he said it does not make any sense for the next Dalai Lama, not to be able to continue the work, unfinished task of the previous Dalai Lama. So China should know that they may be able to pick the next Dalai Lama, but not the real one. The real one will be born in the free country. So I want to send that message strongly. And then the next one, there's already Tibetans have become minority in our own country, right? More Chinese there, and the population transfer can really make the demographic shifts. I'm a scholar in this matter where we talk about ethno-linguistic vitality. When the demographic shifts changes, it is very hard at a certain point of time to be able to bring the balance back. So it is a very serious matter, as you already know, that they not only bring more Chinese civilians to Tibet, but they also started to move the Tibetan nomads from the pasture lands into some concrete buildings, somewhere they build it up, and changing the whole Tibetan culture in many different ways. So those are very serious matters, and I'm sure my colleague Michael Green will have more things to say.
If I may, Congressman, on that last point, Beijing appears confident that their law decreeing the next Dalai Lama will be determined by the Chinese Communist Party will allow them to continue suppressing dissent in Tibet and ultimately win. All indications from scholars who know this region, who've traveled there, are that the opposite will happen, that China will find itself with greater instability, greater violence, greater repression and human suffering. That's one of the many reasons why it's in our national interest to push for the PRC to deal with His Holiness, because this is not going to get better for China either. Second point on your question or your comment about the Twisted Sister in North. I mean, I also found the U.S. press present company excluded pretty fawning, and it was rather shocking when you know about what's happening in North Korea. I, in that context, mentioned when I was first studying Asia in the 1980s, my professors and diplomats taught us that Asian values are different, and that these kind of authoritarian, repressive regimes are culturally accepted. And then around the time I graduated, 4 major Asian countries democratized, And I think today within the academy, among scholars, and also within the State Department, a new generation of diplomats, this is no longer a debate where the China hands are arguing with the human rights hands, really. I think the most qualified people we have in the China desk and in our embassy in Beijing want to move out on this issue. They want to have a consulate in Lhasa. The problem is they don't have guidance from the top right now. And that's why the Tibet coordinator and pushing for the president to raise this issue are so important, because the troops, our diplomats, are ready to take this on. They're not fighting it the way perhaps State Department officials might have 20 years ago.
Thank you. Mr. Wang Chen, let me begin by asking you, when you were in prison, were you aware of the international advocacy on your behalf? And if so, could you give us a sense of the impact that it may have had on you and on those who supported you?
딘저 슈친부 요마다 학고요 말이나 다 저 랭귀지 비고요와 학고요 다 그런 속에가 저 깨땅네 가jan지고요 저런기 지 니땅다 저런기 리까지고요와 대주 정말 실론에 간다시 신고요레스 아니 딘저기 가자 정말 같이 질라져서 다 대응하나 다지 정말 가르 정선나다 제스 정바 제인바 자니 텔라지 저저야던 디기 준선티 가뜨이나 지 알랑고야데 하정게 침부리 다 깨제 랑에 되지나 거기 제소되다 가뜨이나다 지 송초지트와데 자차자다 나랑기 냐냐 토네세나가 자차자 이친도 다지 단적대서
I did not know that there was this widespread campaign on my behalf internationally when I was in prison, but I did know that there were people who were working, trying to work on my behalf. Oftentimes, it was the Chinese authorities themselves who would come and tell me, why is there so much interest in your cause outside? And so I want to say that from my own experience, any voice that is raised on behalf of political prisoners has a very positive impact on even on their lives. I can say from my own experience that it is always good to raise voice on behalf of the political prisoners.
다도지야데 다 지금 단적식 치른 두고요. 지금 좀 실란 저와 지고요는 가자 가리 시고요는 다 능게 잘다 대주 키오나 지금 세제야다 대주 몸보치기거나다 할리위 단적 요아지 다지 좀바게 지 리카고야라고 좀바게 너쩌다야라고 아 리제 크로즈이나 지 너쩌다 지가 그러다 지 주메루메기 지 디지야 되게 거나 지 할리위다 지 팬토 친분도
In terms of restrictions, I can see that when there are more interest, they would restrict my movement, they would monitor me more thoroughly, they would search my things more thoroughly, etc. But at the same time, I can see from the attitude of the prison officials or from other prisoners that the attitudes change when there is international interest in issues like mine.
Has your family back at home and those close to you, have they experienced any kind of official pressure since you departed?
nga bonitsa yongba jila ani nge chokpo mombochigiza 다 thama mombochile leja 다 junangzuga hago yobeje kanda shinduwaji 당에 넘는 당에 아자 같이 지거리 코로즈가 나나다 모타다 딘데 mombo yong니다 이게 찌다 코로즈 이게 신고요 말이 나zo 빈자 주요래 빈자 주대 호탄 두녀요 말이 아 그저 정말다 지가 이게 때 mombo 찌기지 아니 파선 지 사이 적지 즉스 적지 다 딘데게 니츠 mombo 정샤다 junangzuga 신고요리 이제 빈자리 이제 수교적 빠지고요 다 데니 코기 쪽보 역시티 시리즈 코 가디나 콜라지 좋아다 대주게 작조진이티 시리즈 다 딘데게 가자다 mombo thama mombo 찌샤
I've heard that since I left there, the Chinese authorities had visited my sisters and my friends and interrogating them as to how I was able to go about escaping, who arranged all these things. I have 10 family members, none of us read and write, so therefore the Chinese authorities made my sisters sign some things, some documents, etc., and they have been wanting to know, sending vehicles to interrogate my family members many times.
당이 나치고 말이 단당히 지미기다 고 아자게 좋아요. 데라 타마 몽보치 트네루샤. 트네 드로네다 빼가자 몽보치 트. 당가 마즈네 징에 지미기 나나 스탄 두고요. 나가 좀 드라이 스타 지고요. 다 크로즈라이 노 시티 나징게 지 가잔드야 당다 티조 몽보치 나 직파 직정기 드라트샤. 지미기.
Even my wife's family members have also been interrogated. on this issue. So it's just not my side of the family. Even my wife's family members also have been interrogated.
Dr. Georgi, you've written testimony, in your written testimony, you talked about your own experience of China's quote-unquote long arm in academia. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you observed specifically as it relates to the Chinese government's use of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association and the Confucius Institutes?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to express for your leadership and initiative in these matters. I think we all know that in China and Tibet, all over, everything is controlled, micromanaged, strategized, and we know that. And that's why we are making these voices to make a difference there. But what is known less outside the world is the Chinese long arm that's extending everywhere in the world and also in this country. As I reported in my testimony, that 2008, when I was one of the 2 Tibetan students at UC Santa Barbara, and there was a Tibet event, and somehow I think it got reported to the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles, and they must have organized this and brought about 100 Chinese international students, and each of us were surrounded by about 30 of them, and they were screaming and yelling, and they brought this huge Chinese national flag. They would wrap me up because I had a Tibetan flag. And I was telling them, look, learn to respect my flag too. You know, I respect your flag, but let's have a dialogue. But they wouldn't listen to that. And what was behind that was the Chinese Scholars and Students Association, which exists in many universities. And and also, as I reported, that Confucius Institutes in the classrooms, you know, this is making a huge difference in our academic freedom, as you know it very well. But another new thing I want to add, if you may, is I just finished reading one of the most prominent Chinese dissident student leaders, Tiananmen Square, a child links A Heart for Freedom. And she was able to escape here, enjoy the freedom, but then what she realized was, after getting a good education at Harvard, at Princeton, when it came for her to find a job, many companies would say, oops, you are very qualified, we are very sorry, because we have connection with China and we couldn't do it. So that's the invisible hand, right, in many things happening here, and we really have to voice our concerns and make a change there.
And again, what you're describing is the use of a student organization to basically oppress and hassle those who have views or point to facts that run contrary to the narrative that they seek to pursue. And it is one of the things that we're most interested on. And we started last week by writing to all of the higher academic institutions, including one high school, by the way, in the state of Florida. One of them has already canceled the contract, the University of West Florida, and we hope that the others will re-examine that arrangement and ensure that at a minimum, none of these activities are occurring in those institutions, and I suspect that a number more will follow the lead of the University of West Florida, particularly after yesterday's testimony by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation about how they've been very interested and been keeping a close eye on how the Confucius Institutes and the student organizations have been used in this country. Dr. Green, I wanted to ask you, because you've talked about the State Department, and you've said that the people in the trenches on the ground level are all ready to go on this and other issues. But you also said they needed direction from the top, and from that, we're going to have a hearing tomorrow on a nominee that will oversee this portfolio to the State Department, currently acting in that capacity. And so I think it's relevant to ask, what is the perception of the State Department, not the China desk in particular, but just the general leadership over the broader portfolio in the Asia-Pacific region? What is the perception and or the reality of what they prioritize? Is this a pro-engagement direction at the expense of human rights and all sorts of issues we've talked about here today? In essence, is it one of those, we can't raise these issues up because we want to be able to work with them on these other issues and this irritates them? Or is it neglect? Basically, they just haven't paid attention to it. How would you describe, in the most honest terms possible, what the direction of that area of the State Department is today as a general matter?
As I said earlier, Senator, I think that the generation of Foreign Service officers who now lead the East Asia Bureau and play some of the most prominent roles in our embassies embrace the values component of our diplomacy. And there are Foreign Service officers who stand in the rain for 8 hours outside of courtrooms in Guangzhou to let the Chinese authorities know that we're watching the trial of a dissident, for example. And they're dedicated and they take personal risk. The problem they have is the governments in the region don't view them as empowered right now. We don't have a confirmed assistant secretary. We don't have a Tibet coordinator. Until we have those confirmed people in office, then the diplomats in the trenches are not going to be seen as empowered by the administration and the Congress. Getting someone into State Department confirmed in the Assistant Secretary slot, in the Tibet Coordinator slot, the Undersecretary slot will be critical. Key embassies like Korea. The view right now in the region is State Department is not a major player, and I think they are ready to be, and we need to empower them.
And just to be clear, not just putting someone in those positions, but the right person, because the wrong person would also de-emphasize. For example, let's say that someone at the State Department was helping a major American corporation write an apology for having mentioned the issue of Tibet. That would not be the kind of people we want to see involved in this.
So I'm a friend of and an enthusiastic supporter of the candidate, the nominee to be Assistant Secretary, but I'm certainly hoping, Senator, that you're going to ask some hard questions. For example, the administration has put forward the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. The words free and open to me suggest that our values are going to be a critical part of our diplomacy. I hope that in the hearings those dimensions of our foreign policy are emphasized. I hear rumors, I don't know if they're true, that within the State Department there is some guidance to not use the words free and open, but simply to call it our Indo-Pacific strategy. And words matter. So I think that you and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have an important, if I may say, sir, an important role in using these hearings to answer those questions and get nominees to put on the record not only their priorities, but the actions they're going to take. The candidate for the nominee for Assistant Secretary is not responsible for nominating or appointing the Undersecretary, who would, I assume, be the Tibet coordinator, but that's an appropriate forum to push the administration, I think.
My final question, and then the co-chairman is going to wrap up. He has a couple more questions, but the term community of common destiny, are you familiar with its use repeatedly in recent times by the Chinese Communist Party and international fora? Have you heard that terminology?
I've heard that and other similar phrases.
And basically that phraseology, which by the way has been rejected by a number of countries, Vietnam stands out as one, India and others on different occasions as being part of a communique, is an effort not just to change the dynamic of international politics, but the rhetoric of it. And it is an effort, and I use this forum to point that out, it is an effort to change the rhetoric and language and the terminology to basically argue towards a world in which the values that we're talking about here, democracy, freedom, human rights, are de-emphasized. Even alliances are de-emphasized. And we enter some new order that involves quote-unquote partnerships and judging human rights by a different standard and non-interference. It's the same concept that you see when they have a internet freedom conference by one of the leading oppressive governments in the world against internet freedom. And so I only raise that because terminology matters, and you see it used repeatedly as a weapon in the case of Tibet, but others. And just rhetorically, is it your experience that on this particular issue regarding Tibet, but on the broader issue of China's government trying to reorder global affairs, that we need to keep a close eye on the use of language, of the words being used, because they are certainly trying to replace what human rights and self-determination means. And by the way, it's not just limited to Tibet. Many of us were deeply disappointed to see the recent decisions by the Vatican, allowing for the first time in human history, or certainly in the history of the Church, for its leadership to be appointed by certainly in the modern, I imagine, go back to 1500s, we had some pretty bad appointments, but certainly in the modern world. So language matters, and the words that are being used, we need to, because they don't mean the same thing.
I could not agree with you more, Senator. I've written about this as an academic and in policy terms. Xi Jinping tried to convince the Obama administration to endorse a concept called the new model of great power relations, that to avoid conflict, the U.S. and China had to have a condominium and as major powers. And in this formulation, Japan, India, Korea, Australia, democracies were second-tier powers. And senior people in the Obama administration embraced this. The Chinese then tried to get the Trump White House to support what they called a global strategic partnership. Same rhetorical device to suggest that China and the U.S. would arbitrate issues, no values. Japan, India, these other powers were secondary. One of the things I find compelling about the administration's free and open Indo-Pacific concept, this free and open Indo-Pacific concept, is a complete rebuttal of that by design. Well received in India, Japan, Australia. And so the words matter a lot. And we're not always attentive to them, but within Asia, when this idea of a new model of U.S. China relations as great powers started to get currency with some senior officials in Washington, it had a major effect on how Japan, Korea, Australia, Vietnam viewed our staying power and our commitment to our values. So I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's an important area for the Congress to pay attention to.
My favorite lines in any hearing. I couldn't agree with you more. I love that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Rubio, and thank you for your answers to all of our questions earlier. I do have just a couple of final questions. So, one, when is the world, in your opinion, going to get more aggressive with regards to, two Nobel Peace Prizes, obviously the Dalai Lama and Liu Xiaobo. He dies, doesn't get the medical attention that he needed, and of course, the Dalai Lama got the Nobel Peace Prize in '89, and Liu Xiaobo's wife is doing terribly, and we've made requests, demands, every other kind of admonishment to the dictatorship to let her come here, or at least treat her with respect. And it's a microcosm of what they do every single day in Lhasa and elsewhere in Tibet, as well as in other places in China, throughout the mainland. So my question is, I'm worried about this administration not being as focused. The last administration dropped the ball in a major way. Previous administrations have dropped the ball. Bill Clinton, who criticized the President Bush, the first one, and talked about coddling dictatorship, then coddled like nobody else before had coddled dictatorship, including bringing in the operational commander of Tiananmen Square, Cha Tien, and gave him a 19-gun salute at the White House, which I continue to believe was outrageous. He should have been sent to The Hague for prosecution for crimes against humanity rather than be giving those honors. So, we seem to be past his prologue, on the verge of repeating many of those same mistakes unless there is a game changer. I note with some gratitude, real gratitude, that Secretary Tillerson named China as a Tier 3 country pursuant to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And I wrote that law, so I watched that very carefully. We tried repeatedly to get previous administrations to do it, not just as an automatic downgrade, which happened once during Obama. And it's also a CPC country because of its religious persecution. But both of those laws, and it hasn't happened on trafficking, have a consequence action, a penalty phase. We need to see penalties. Our civil rights laws work better because there are real, tangible, predictable consequences when others, colleges, for example, commit them. So you might want to speak to that. Finally, on the Confucius Institutes, I've asked the General Accountability Office to do a huge study on what their influence is, what the parameters are of their existence. There's 118 of them at least. There are 3 in my state of New Jersey. And what kind of baggage do they carry in terms of their soft power? They're here to influence. It's a way of getting some additional money for colleges and universities in the United States, but they may even think it's prestigious. But if you're part of a propaganda long arm, what good are you really doing? And this administration, the Trump administration, talks about reciprocity. Where's the reciprocity for us to have unfettered access to the Chinese venues or campuses, to be able to speak boldly about human rights and religious freedom and all the other, they have to pull their punches, obviously, when they're in country. So if you want to speak to that as well.
Well, if I may, Professor Tenzin Dorji, you also have experiences as a scholar. I'm a professor at Georgetown University with the Confucius Institutes. We don't have one at Georgetown. We're a pretty well-endowed major university. Some of our sister Jesuit colleges and universities do. When I visited and asked about it, the teachers are all very different. Some of the teachers sort of laugh off instructions from Beijing to teach certain things about Taiwan or Tibet. Others faithfully follow Beijing's instructions. My general view on this one is that there should be much more scrutiny, but ultimately, as an academic, I think universities have to police themselves, and there are ways to have these institutes, but they have to have an agreement with complete academic freedom, and they have to be monitored by faculty, and that hasn't happened in many cases.
Can any of them teach about the Dalai Lama, for example?
Well, I think the curriculum should be approved by the faculty at these universities, and there should probably be committees on the faculty with China scholars or outside advisors that take a look at the curriculum. But in principle, the demand for learning Mandarin is enormous, and there aren't enough dollars in a lot of schools to fulfill that. So I don't have a problem taking the money and the instructors. I think universities have to be responsible for ensuring academic freedom, checking the curriculum, the kinds of things that I think many faculty would like to do. If you empower the faculty in the process, they'll put pressure on their own administrations.
But if I'm a college university president, you know, one of their prime missions is to find spigots of funds.
Yep.
It's counterproductive from that perspective to be monitoring closely the exclusion of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism and the terrible atrocities committed against Tibetan Buddhists, as well as every other human rights abuse. You just bypass it, never comes up, and you talk about, you know, a great culture, which China is, it has been for centuries. The people are unbelievable, but you still get this this very, very, you know, Potemkin village perspective about what's going on in China. And I find that with members of Congress. They go on a trip and they're shown the sites in a way that, and we say, raise human rights issues, get our database from the China Commission and bring up names. And you'll appreciate this, when Frank Wolf and I and Scott Flipsy were in Beijing, Condoleezza Rice was on her way in, and all the talk was, what venues will they go watch? You know, and I said, the heck, I love the Olympics, you know, I love sports. Hopefully we all do, but you know, not at the exclusion of get prisoners out. Here's a golden opportunity to do so. And our database, when we compared to what they had at the embassy and at the State Department, it was paltry. One of the FSO, Foreign Service officers, said, you've got a much better one than we have. It shouldn't be that way. They're the State Department. They're there engaging every single day. So I'm very worried about who's in the classroom monitoring. You know, a curriculum could be a bare bones curriculum and doesn't get into depth. And yet the Dalai Lama, and when, God forbid, they pick the next Dalai Lama, you know, will there be at the Confucius Institutes, you know, what an atrocity that is? They have no right to do that.
This is a complicated issue, and it's a problem. You know, on some campuses, not mine, right. Chinese student associations are using the vogue language and accusing Tibetans of microaggression and things like that. And there are Chinese student associations that are watching students in the classroom in universities. We have a problem that particularly professors who are not tenured, who have to publish, if they're doing research on China, especially on Tibet or Xinjiang, they can't publish anything risky or they won't get a visa. And so there's a lot of self-censorship. The access to China generally, not just the Tibet Autonomous Region, is harder. It's very hard for scholars, including people like me, who have some background in policy, to get visas because the United Fronts Department is scrutinizing which institutions, universities, professors are safe. So we have a major problem in terms of reciprocity and in terms of influences here. But I do have faith in our higher education institutions. I do think that with the right focus, university presidents, faculties are going to address this. They're going to have to.
Well, we're hoping our GEO report will expose what's good and bad and ugly about all of this. I would just point out, after I worked on Chen Guangzhen's case, and we had 4 hearings about him. He phoned in, you might recall, and what a great human rights defender he was there, and now continues to be. I couldn't get a visa for 8 years. And I only got one, you know, several months back, because I was going to NYU Shanghai campus to give a speech. And it would have been harder for them to deny that one in plain light than what they were doing before that. So, you know, if they could do that to a member of Congress, we asked the administration to step in. They did, thankfully. The Speaker of the House, John Boehner, wrote a letter to the ambassador and said, what are you doing? You know, he's chairman of our Human Rights Committee on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's co-chair and chair, depending on the year, of the China Commission. And yet they denied it. And if they do that to the visibility of a member of Congress, how much easier some academic or anyone else to say, you know, you don't get to come. So I think, you know, we really have to be far more aggressive in holding the Chinese to account. And, you know, I know that the focus has been largely on how do we mitigate the danger of North Korea and get China to finally play a role that is constructive rather than ambivalence or worse. But that can't preclude a human rights focus because the victims are every day and they're proliferating. They're getting far worse, particularly with these new laws on NGOs, as you pointed out, the tightening space, and the new law on the signification of religion, which is even worse than what it's been. So thank you all, unless you have any final comments before we conclude. Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I was meaning to say this before, but somehow I got caught up in responding to the questions like a student. And I really very much appreciate the Congressional-Executive Commission in China for all the great works you have done, especially the database you have on the prisoners of conscience. That's very helpful to us. And the last thing I want to say is that, you know, all of us, United States, private companies, especially China, probably Dalai Lama would say this, we should look at things from all situations, and we will all become more open to international standards and do the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, I would just conclude with this, too, as well. Even though I chair this commission, when it came up for a vote in the House, I voted no. You know why? For years, a group of us wanted to say that most favored nation status had to have human rights linkage. You don't have an unfettered exchange of goods and services without first, and no labor rights, for example, in China, all the other barbaric human rights abuses that are committed, including torture, which our distinguished witness spoke about earlier and endured, that if you want to trade with conditionality. Well, this commission was created as part of a reversal of what we thought was going to be an executive order with teeth by Bill Clinton, and it was patterned after the Helsinki Convention, the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I also serve as chair and co-chair. So it's a great idea, but it was done with a piece of legislation to give a talking point to those who wanted to trade in an unfettered way with China without any kind of human rights conditionality, and which I found to be appalling. We lost. We had the votes, frankly, to take away or limit MFN. I joined with Nancy Pelosi and David Bonnier and others. I was the Republican lead. And Bill Clinton jumped in the gap and said, I'll do an executive order, and put all these human rights conditionalities in the executive order, which we applauded, and then realized it was a ruse. Within 1 year, he took his executive order, ripped it in half, and he did it on a Friday afternoon when everybody was leaving, and the Chinese took, that was May 1994, took a measure of our country and its commitment to human rights and said, they don't mean it. Profits trump human rights. We've been trying to reclaim that ground ever since. My hope is that this president will do it. He's done it on trafficking, and that was a good first step, but there's far more that he has to do. The special envoy is a no-brainer. He should name him immediately so that individual can start doing their good work. But, you know, it's been years of catch-up, and we lost it in May of 1994 when he delinked it. We had the votes in the House and the Senate. It was totally bipartisan to either limit or take away, condition for real most favored nation status. Now it's permanent. We don't even do an annual review. So I say all this because bad policy coming out of the United States Congress, but especially the executive branch, has disadvantaged religious and political prisoners and made life worse. I was so glad when you said earlier that the picture of the Dalai Lama and President Bush inspired hope and tears among people. That's an encouragement. It means that what happens here might have some impact on the ground in places like Lhasa, but we need to do far more. And again, working with Chairman Rubio, who is a tremendous chairman, We're doing our level best, and we're going to continue it. Your insights today really help us to know how to proceed. So thank you so very much. Hearing's adjourned.